August 12, 1945. The war in Europe had been over for 3 months, but in a small prisoner of war camp nestled in the Yorkshire countryside, 42 German women still lived behind barbed wire, uncertain of their futures. They had awakened that morning to an announcement that would change everything they thought they understood about their enemy, about abundance, and about what it meant to show mercy to those who had fought against you. Captain Millicent Cartwright stood before the assembled women in the camp's dining hall, her crisp British uniform a stark contrast to the faded gray auxiliary clothes the prisoners still wore. The women sat at long wooden tables, their posture still military straight despite months of captivity, their faces reflecting the exhaustion of a war that had taken everything from them except their dignity. This morning, Captain Cartwright announced in her clear, measured English, "We are serving you a proper, full English breakfast. The rationing restrictions have finally been lifted, enough for us to share what we've been wanting to give you for months now. Consider it a celebration of peace." The words meant little to most of the women, whose English remained limited despite their months in British captivity. But when the kitchen doors swung open and Corporal Frederick Hobbs began bringing out the plates, the room fell into absolute silence. 21-year-old Edeltraud Bauer, who insisted everyone call her Traudel, felt her breath catch in her throat as she stared at what was being placed before her. The plate was piled with food in a way she hadn't seen in nearly 4 years. 2 fried eggs, their yolks golden and intact, sat beside 3 strips of bacon that still sizzled slightly. Fat sausages, the kind made with real meat instead of the sawdust mixture they had eaten in Germany during the final years of the war, rested against a mound of baked beans in rich tomato sauce. Grilled mushrooms, roasted tomatoes, and thick slices of toast spread with real yellow butter completed what seemed like an impossible feast. Beside her, Christelle Neumann made a small choking sound. Across the table, 18-year-old Luitgard Berger began to cry silently, tears streaming down her thin face as she stared at the food. Even Walburga Richter, at 28, the eldest among them and their unofficial leader, sat frozen with her hands in her lap, unable to reach for her fork. "This cannot be real," Traudel whispered in German. "This is what we served at my sister's wedding. Before the war, I thought I would never see such food again." Captain Cartwright, who had been watching their reactions with growing concern, approached their table. She had learned enough German to understand basic phrases. "It's real," she said gently in accented German. "Please, eat. You're not prisoners anymore. You're simply people who deserve a decent meal." But Traudel couldn't move. None of them could. Because they all understood what this breakfast meant, even if the British didn't. This wasn't just food. This was evidence of a world they thought had disappeared forever. November 3, 1944. The transport truck rattled through the narrow roads of rural Yorkshire, carrying its cargo of defeated enemies toward an uncertain future. Inside, 42 women sat in silence, their hands bound loosely with rope, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. They had been traveling for 3 days since their capture in Belgium, moving through a landscape that grew increasingly foreign with each passing mile. Traudel pressed her face against the small window, watching the green countryside roll past. Even in November, Britain looked impossibly lush compared to the bombed-out cities and scorched fields she had left behind. The farms they passed appeared intact, untouched by the destruction that had consumed Germany. She saw cattle grazing peacefully in meadows, sheep dotting the hillsides like scattered clouds. It seemed obscene somehow, this abundance existing while her homeland starved. "They told us Britain was suffering," Christelle whispered beside her. "They said the British people were desperate, that they would treat us with cruelty because they had nothing themselves." Traudel didn't answer. She was 21 years old and had spent the last 2 years serving in the German Women's Auxiliary Corps as a radio operator. She had believed everything she was told about the war, about Germany's righteousness, about the evil nature of their enemies. Now, watching this peaceful countryside, she wondered what else had been a lie. The truck turned through iron gates and into what was clearly a military installation. But unlike the massive prisoner camps they had heard about, this facility was small, almost intimate. A collection of wooden barracks surrounded a central courtyard, all enclosed by barbed wire fencing that somehow seemed less menacing than Traudel had expected. Walburga Richter, sitting across from her, straightened her shoulders as the truck came to a stop. "Listen to me," she said quietly in German, her voice carrying the authority of her years. "We are still German soldiers. We will conduct ourselves with dignity. We will show them that we are not afraid." But they were afraid. Traudel could see it in every face as the truck doors opened and British soldiers gestured for them to climb down. Young Luitgard Berger, barely 18, trembled so violently that Traudel took her arm to steady her. The girl had been captured during her first month of service, had never even fired a weapon, and looked now like a frightened child despite her auxiliary uniform. A British officer approached, her uniform crisp and authoritative. She was perhaps 35, with dark hair pulled back severely and eyes that assessed them with cool professionalism. "Captain Millicent Cartwright," she introduced herself in clipped English. "You will be housed in Barrack C. You will follow all camp regulations. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention." None of the women understood the English words, but they understood the tone. They were prisoners now, completely at the mercy of people they had been taught to hate and fear. To understand what the full English breakfast meant to these women, one must first understand the hunger they carried inside them like a physical weight. Traudel's last real meal before joining the Women's Auxiliary Corps had been in the spring of 1943, more than 2.5 years earlier. Her mother had somehow saved enough ration cards to create what they called a feast, though it would have been considered meager even by wartime standards. There had been dark bread, made with wheat, that was only half mixed with potato flour instead of the usual sawdust and chestnuts. A thin soup with actual pieces of turnip and one precious potato divided among 5 people. Her mother had even managed to acquire a small piece of margarine, which they had spread so thinly on their bread that it was more memory than substance. That meal had felt like abundance because they had grown accustomed to so much less. By 1944, the food situation in Germany had become desperate. Traudel remembered the ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns that tasted like bitter water. The bread that was more sawdust than grain, that sat heavy in the stomach without providing any real nourishment. The soup made from vegetable peelings and whatever weeds could be gathered from bombed-out lots. Meat had become a distant memory, something spoken of in hushed tones like a fairy tale from another lifetime. In the Women's Auxiliary Corps, their rations had been slightly better than civilian allocations, but not by much. Christel, who had served as a supply clerk, knew the exact numbers by heart. Each soldier was allotted 300 grams of bread per day. She would recite like a grim litany, 25 grams of meat per week, if available. Potatoes when they could be obtained, usually half-rotten. Sugar was a luxury that appeared perhaps once a month. The youngest among them, Luitgard, had enlisted in September of 1944, just 2 months before their capture. She told them one night about her last meal at home, her voice breaking with the memory. "My mother gave me her entire week's butter ration," she whispered. "It was perhaps 10 grams, barely enough to cover one piece of bread. She spread it on thick and made me eat it while she watched. She said I needed to remember what butter tasted like in case I never saw it again." Walburga rarely spoke of her own hunger, but once, late at night in the barracks, she had shared her story. "I was married in 1938, she said quietly. Our wedding feast had roasted pork, potato dumplings, red cabbage with apples, and 3 different kinds of cake. My husband's family owned a bakery. We thought we would always have enough to eat." Her voice had caught on the past tense. Her husband was dead now, killed in Russia. The bakery had been destroyed in an air raid, and the world where such abundance existed had disappeared so completely that it seemed like something they might have only imagined. The first weeks in the British camp passed in a fog of routine and uncertainty. The women woke at 6 each morning to the sound of a bell, dressed in their worn auxiliary uniforms, and stood for morning count in the courtyard regardless of weather. The Yorkshire winter was damp and cold in a way that seemed to seep into bones, different from the harsh, dry cold of German winters they had known. Walburga established order among them immediately. She assigned sleeping quarters, created work rotations, and insisted they maintain military discipline even in captivity. "We are still representatives of Germany," she told them firmly. "We will not give them reason to see us as anything less than soldiers." So they stood straight during inspections. They kept their barracks spotlessly clean. They spoke only in German among themselves, maintaining a wall of language and culture between themselves and their captors. Traudl found herself watching the British guards carefully, trying to reconcile what she observed with what she had been taught to expect. The guards were mostly young men deemed unfit for combat service, along with a handful of women from the Auxiliary Territorial Service. They treated the German prisoners with a distant professionalism that surprised Traudl. There was no cruelty, no violence, no signs of the barbarism German propaganda had promised. Instead, there was simply routine, regulation, and a kind of careful neutrality. Captain Cartwright conducted inspections twice weekly, walking through the barracks with her hands clasped behind her back, her expression unreadable. She spoke to them only through an interpreter, a middle-aged British woman named Mrs. Davies, who had lived in Berlin before the war. The captain's questions were always practical, never personal. "Are the facilities adequate? Do you have complaints about treatment? Is anyone ill?" The women answered in monosyllables, maintaining their defensive silence. But Traudl noticed things the others might have missed. She noticed how Captain Cartwright's eyes lingered on Lutgard's thin frame with what looked like concern. She noticed how the captain checked the temperature of their barracks personally, running her hand along the radiators to ensure they provided adequate heat. She noticed that their food rations, while simple, were consistent and sufficient in a way that German rations hadn't been for years. The meals were plain but regular. Porridge for breakfast, sometimes with a spoonful of jam, bread and cheese for lunch, occasionally supplemented with an apple or carrot. A hot meal in the evening, usually some variation of stew or soup with potatoes and occasional pieces of meat. It was institutional food, bland and unexciting, but it was more than many of them had eaten in months. Christelle, ever practical, began keeping track of their rations in a small notebook. "We're receiving approximately 1,800 calories per day," she reported to Walburga. "That's more than German soldiers were getting by the end of the war." The realization sat uncomfortably among them. They were prisoners, yet they were being fed better than they had been as free women serving their own country. It was another crack in the foundation of everything they thought they understood about this war. Edeltraud Bauer had been born in Stuttgart in 1924, the youngest daughter of a postal worker and a seamstress. Her childhood had been comfortable, if not wealthy, marked by Sunday dinners of roasted chicken and the sweet yeast cakes her grandmother made for holidays. She remembered butter as a normal part of life, spread thickly on warm bread, melted over potatoes, incorporated into every baked good without a second thought. The war had changed everything slowly, then all at once. First, butter became expensive, then rationed, then a memory. By 1942, when Traudl was 18, butter had become something spoken of with longing, like talking about a dead relative. She remembered the exact moment she realized she couldn't remember what real butter tasted like. The memory had faded, replaced by the greasy substitute of margarine, and then nothing at all. She had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1943, motivated by a mixture of patriotic duty and practical necessity. The military provided food, shelter, and purpose during a time when civilian life offered none of those things reliably. She trained as a radio operator, learning Morse code and radio protocols, believing she was serving her country's defense. Her assignment had taken her to Belgium, where she worked in a communications center coordinating troop movements. She had been good at her job, efficient and precise, never questioning the orders she helped transmit. She knew now that some of those orders had likely contributed to terrible things, but at the time she had simply done what was asked of her, believing it was right. Capture had come suddenly during the German retreat in October. Allied forces had overrun their position before they could evacuate, and she found herself with her hands raised, surrounded by American soldiers who looked absurdly young and well-fed. They had processed the women prisoners quickly, separating them from male soldiers, and eventually transferred them to British custody for transport to England. Now, sitting in this Yorkshire camp, Traudl found herself becoming the unofficial bridge between the rigid military discipline Walburga insisted upon and the confused emotions the younger women felt. She translated not just language but feelings, helping Luitgard understand camp regulations while also helping Walburga see when the younger ones needed comfort rather than orders. Christelle became her closest friend during those first weeks. They shared a bunk in the corner of the barracks, and at night they would whisper to each other about their lives before the war. Christelle had worked in her father's pharmacy in Munich, had been engaged to a soldier who died at Stalingrad, had joined the auxiliary corps because she couldn't bear to stay in the empty apartment they had planned to share. Together they watched their British captors with careful attention, trying to understand these people they had been taught to hate. They noticed Corporal Hobbs, a young man with sandy hair and a gentle manner, who never shouted and always said please, even when giving orders to prisoners. They noticed how the female guards treated them with a distant respect rather than contempt. And slowly, almost against their will, they began to wonder if everything they had believed might have been wrong. The first crack in the wall between captors and captives came during a cold snap in late November. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the barracks heating system, already inadequate, struggled to keep the rooms above freezing. The women huddled under their thin blankets, wearing every piece of clothing they owned, their breath visible in the frigid air. Luitgard, always fragile, developed a cough that worsened each day. She tried to hide it during inspections, knowing that showing weakness might mean separation from the group, but by the third day she was running a fever. Traudl and Crystal took turns sitting with her at night, trying to keep her warm with their own body heat, worried that the cough might develop into something more serious. Corporal Frederick Hobbs noticed during his evening rounds. He was perhaps 26 years old, with a Yorkshire accent so thick that even his English comrades sometimes struggled to understand him. He had been assigned to the women's camp because a childhood illness had left him with a weak heart, making him unfit for combat duty. He approached the bunk where Luitgard lay shivering and stopped, his boyish face creasing with concern. He disappeared without a word, and the women assumed he had left to report the illness. But 15 minutes later, he returned carrying 2 heavy wool blankets, the kind issued to British soldiers rather than prisoners. He also carried a tin cup filled with steaming liquid that smelled of honey and herbs. "For the girl," he said in his rough English, gesturing to Luitgard. His accent made the words almost incomprehensible, but his intention was clear. He draped the blankets over her himself, tucking them around her thin shoulders with surprising gentleness. Then he held out the cup, making drinking motions. Traudl accepted it cautiously, sniffing the contents. It was some kind of tea, sweet with honey and laced with herbs she didn't recognize. She helped Luitgard sit up and guided the cup to her lips. The girl drank, and for the first time in days, her shivering began to subside. "My Gran's recipe," Corporal Hobbs explained, though none of them understood the words. He pantomimed drinking, then pointed to his chest and made exaggerated breathing motions, apparently indicating that it was good for coughs. He returned every evening for the next week, always bringing fresh tea, always checking that Luitgard still had the extra blankets. The act of kindness rippled through the barracks. The women had been prepared for many things in captivity, but not for this casual compassion from an enemy soldier. They whispered about it in German after lights out, trying to reconcile it with everything they had been taught. "He could be punished for giving us extra blankets," Christelle observed quietly. "Those are military issue. He's taking a risk." Walburga, ever cautious, warned them not to trust it. "It could be a trick," she said, "a way to make us lower our guard." But Traudl, watching Luitgard's cough finally begin to ease, wasn't so sure. She had seen genuine concern in Corporal Hobbs's eyes, the same look her own brother used to have when she was ill. It didn't feel like a trick. It felt like simple human decency. December brought shorter days and longer nights, and with them came a torture the women hadn't anticipated. Every morning around 6:30, Just after wake-up call, the wind would shift and carry the smell of the guards' breakfast across the compound. The aroma of frying bacon would drift through the barbed wire like a cruel reminder of everything they had lost. Traudel would lie in her bunk, eyes closed, breathing in that impossible scent and trying to remember the last time she had eaten bacon. It must have been before the war, perhaps at a Sunday breakfast when her father was still alive. The memory was so distant it felt like something from another person's life entirely. "Real coffee," Christelle whispered one morning, her voice almost reverent. "Can you smell it? Not ersatz, not acorn water, actual coffee." The smell of real coffee was distinct from the bitter substitutes they had grown accustomed to in Germany. It had a richness, a depth that the roasted grain and chicory mixtures could never replicate. Some mornings they could also smell fresh bread, not the dense sawdust-laden loaves they had eaten during the war, but proper bread with a crust that crackled. Luitgard, recovered from her cough but still painfully thin, began lingering near the camp kitchen whenever her work duties took her past it. She wasn't alone. Several of the younger women found excuses to walk by the building, drawn by smells that seemed to promise a world where abundance still existed. One afternoon, Corporal Hobbs caught Luitgard standing near the kitchen door, her eyes closed, simply breathing in the aroma of whatever was being prepared inside. Instead of reprimanding her, he smiled and gestured for her to wait. He disappeared inside and returned a moment later with a thick slice of bread, still warm, spread with what looked like real butter and jam. He held it out to her, but Luitgard stepped back, afraid. She glanced around nervously, knowing that accepting food outside of regular rations could be considered fraternizing with the enemy, could get both her and the corporal in trouble. "It's all right," he said gently, still holding out the bread. "Nobody's watching. Just a bit of bread. You're too thin, lass." Luitgard took the bread with shaking hands and bit into it, and immediately tears began streaming down her face. The butter was real, creamy, and rich. The jam was strawberry, sweet and thick with actual pieces of fruit. She ate it slowly, savoring every bite, and when she finished, she whispered "Donkey" so quietly that Corporal Hobbs almost didn't hear. Word of his kindness spread through the barracks that evening. The women debated what it meant, whether they should report it to Walburga, whether accepting such gifts was a betrayal of their dignity as German soldiers. But privately, each of them hoped that perhaps Corporal Hobbs might show them similar kindness, might offer them a taste of the abundance that existed just beyond the barbed wire. The kitchen became a focal point of longing, the smells that emanated from it a daily reminder that somewhere in the world, people still ate properly. That not everyone was starving, that the war hadn't destroyed everything, only the world they had known. Captain Cartwright called a meeting of the German prisoners on December 20th. Through Mrs. Davies, the interpreter, she announced that the women would be permitted to celebrate Christmas in a modest way. They could create decorations from available materials, hold a small service if they wished, and there would be a special meal on Christmas Day. The announcement was met with stunned silence. Many of the women hadn't celebrated Christmas properly in years. By 1943, the holiday had become a shadow of itself in Germany, marked more by absence than by any kind of festivity. The idea that their British captors would acknowledge their holiday, much less facilitate its celebration, seemed incomprehensible. Walburga, always suspicious of British motives, nevertheless recognized the offer for what it was, a gesture of goodwill that would be insulting to refuse. She organized the women into work groups. Some fashioned decorations from scraps of paper and cloth. Others, including Traudel, worked on preparing songs for a small service. Christelle discovered she had a talent for paper crafts, creating delicate snowflakes from old newspapers and stars from cardboard salvaged from supply boxes. Luitgard helped string them around the barracks, transforming the stark military space into something almost festive. The women worked with a quiet intensity, finding unexpected comfort in these simple creative acts. On Christmas Eve, Captain Cartwright made an unprecedented visit to the barracks. She carried with her a box of candles, real wax candles rather than the tallow substitutes the women had grown accustomed to. She also brought a small pine tree no more than 3 feet tall that she set up in the corner of their common room. "For your celebration," she said through Mrs. Davies. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but Trowdell thought she detected something softer in the captain's eyes, a recognition of their shared humanity despite the circumstances that had made them enemies. That evening, the women gathered around their small tree and sang. They began with traditional German carols, Stille Nacht and O Tannenbaum, their voices harmonizing naturally despite having no formal practice. The songs carried them back to childhoods when Christmas meant family and warmth and abundance, and more than one woman wept while singing. Then Trowdell, surprising even herself, suggested they learn an English carol. She had been studying English with increasing dedication, practicing with Mrs. Davies during her translation sessions. She taught the others Silent Night in English, the same song they had just sung in German, and their accented pronunciation filled the barracks with an unexpected bridge between languages, between nations, between past and present. Christmas morning brought the promised special meal. It wasn't elaborate by pre-war standards, but after years of deprivation it seemed like a feast. There was roasted chicken, real potatoes with butter, carrots, and even a small pudding for dessert. The women ate slowly, savoring every bite, many of them crying openly at the abundance. Corporal Hobbs worked the serving line that day, and as he placed food on Trowdell's plate, he smiled and said, "Merry Christmas" in careful practiced German, Frohe Weihnachten. The effort he had made to learn those words in their language touched something deep inside her. She responded in English, her accent thick, but her intention clear. "Thank you, Corporal. Merry Christmas to you." January 1945 brought news that shattered the fragile peace the women had found. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, they began liberating concentration camps and discovering the full extent of Nazi atrocities. British and American newspapers carried photographs and detailed accounts of what they found at Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and other camps whose names the German women had never heard. Captain Cartwright made the decision to allow the prisoners access to these newspapers. It was controversial among her staff, some of whom argued that the women might become dangerous if confronted with their country's defeat, but the captain believed they had a right to know what had been done in their nation's name. Trowdell was in the camp library, a small room with donated books and newspapers. When she first saw the photographs, they were grainy, printed in black and white on cheap wartime paper. But the images were clear enough: piles of emaciated bodies, living skeletons behind barbed wire, mass graves being excavated by German civilians forced to witness what had happened in their midst. Her hands began to shake as she read the accompanying articles. The descriptions were clinical, almost too detailed, explaining the systematic murder of millions. Jews, Roma, political prisoners, homosexuals, disabled people, all killed in an organized campaign of extermination. The reporters estimated numbers in the millions, numbers so large they seemed impossible to comprehend. "This cannot be real," she whispered, but even as she said it, she knew it was. The evidence was too overwhelming, too well documented. She remembered now the whispered rumors she had heard during her service, stories about camps in the East, about trainloads of people disappearing. She had dismissed them as enemy propaganda, as lies meant to demoralize German forces. Christelle found her there, staring at the newspaper with tears streaming down her face. She looked over Trowdell's shoulder and gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. They stood together in silence, trying to process what they were seeing. Other women gathered, drawn by their distress. One by one they looked at the newspapers, and one by one their faces reflected the same horror. Luitgard began to sob, great heaving cries that shook her whole body. Even Walburga, always stoic, sat down heavily in a chair, her face drained of all color. "Did we know?" Christelle asked, her voice barely audible. "Did we know and pretend we didn't? Or were we truly ignorant?" It was the question that would haunt all of them for the rest of their lives. Trowdell thought back to her time serving in Belgium, to the orders she had helped transmit, to the trainloads of people she had seen being transported east. She had asked no questions, had simply done her job efficiently. Was that complicity or ignorance? Where was the line between the two? That night, the barracks was silent, except for quiet weeping. The women lay in their bunks, each wrestling with the revelation that they had served a regime that committed atrocities beyond imagination. They had believed they were defending their homeland. Instead, they had been part of something monstrous, Traudl wrote in the small diary she had managed to keep. What kind of Germany do we return to? What kind of Germany were we defending? Everything I believed was a lie. August arrived with unexpected warmth, and with it came news that changed everything. The war in the Pacific had ended with Japan's surrender. For the first time in 6 years, the entire world was at peace. In the Yorkshire camp, the atmosphere shifted from uncertain waiting to active preparation for the prisoners' eventual repatriation. Captain Cartwright called an assembly for August 12th, and the women gathered in the dining hall with a mixture of hope and dread. They had been prisoners for 9 months now, long enough that the camp had become familiar, even comfortable in its routines. The prospect of leaving meant facing the devastated homeland they had been reading about in newspapers. The captain stood before them, and for the first time since they had arrived, she was smiling. "Ladies," she began, waiting for Mrs. Davies to translate, "the war is truly over. Peace has come to the entire world. In recognition of this momentous occasion, and because rationing restrictions have finally been eased enough to allow it, we are going to share with you a proper British tradition." She paused, letting the translator catch up. "Tomorrow morning, you will be served a full English breakfast. It is our way of celebrating, our way of welcoming peace, and our way of showing you that even in the darkest times, there can still be moments of abundance and joy." The women exchanged confused glances. Most of them had no idea what a full English breakfast entailed. The phrase meant nothing to them beyond its literal translation. Traudl leaned toward Christelle and whispered, "What is this breakfast she speaks of?" Christelle shrugged. "Perhaps eggs? Some kind of British custom?" That evening, Corporal Hobbs appeared more animated than usual during his rounds. He was grinning, clearly pleased about something, and he made a point of stopping by Traudl's bunk. "Tomorrow," he said in his thick Yorkshire accent, "you're in for a proper treat. Best meal you'll have had in years, I reckon." Traudl struggled to understand his English through the accent, but she caught the words treat and best meal. She smiled politely, still unsure what to expect. Corporal Hobbs had never steered them wrong before. His small kindnesses had been genuine, but surely he was exaggerating. How good could one breakfast be? The women went to bed that night with curiosity replacing some of their usual anxiety. Luitgard, always excitable despite everything she had endured, whispered to the others that perhaps the British were going to give them extra porridge or maybe even some jam with their bread. The modest speculation reflected how low their expectations had become. But Walburga, who had been reading British newspapers more carefully than the others, had a different understanding. She had seen references to the full English breakfast in articles about British culture and tradition. If she was right about what it entailed, tomorrow morning was going to be far more significant than any of them imagined. Sleep came slowly that night. The women lay in their bunks, wondering what the morning would bring, unable to imagine that a simple breakfast could transform their understanding of mercy, abundance, and what it meant to show kindness to those who had once been enemies. The dining hall had been transformed overnight. The long wooden tables, usually bare except for basic place settings, were now covered with white cloth. Real plates, not the usual tin mess kits, sat at each place. The early morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating the room in a way that made it feel almost celebratory. The women filed in at their usual breakfast time, 6:30, and took their seats in confusion. The white tablecloths alone seemed extravagant, wasteful even, given that they were still prisoners, regardless of the war's end. Traudl sat between Christelle and Luitgard, her hands folded in her lap, waiting to see what this British tradition would bring. Captain Cartwright stood at the front of the room. "This morning," she announced through Mrs. Davies, we share with you a tradition that represents the best of British hospitality. A full English breakfast is more than just food. It is a symbol of home, of comfort, of better days. We give it to you freely, with the hope that peace will bring better days for all of us. The kitchen doors swung open, and Corporal Hobbs emerged carrying the first tray. Behind him came other British staff members, all bearing plates piled high with food. As the first plate was set before Troudel, she stopped breathing. 2 fried eggs, their yolks, a deep golden yellow, sat in the center of the plate. 3 strips of bacon, crisped to perfection, lay beside them. 2 fat sausages, clearly made with real meat, rested against a mound of baked beans in thick tomato sauce. There were grilled mushrooms, their caps glistening with butter, roasted tomatoes, still steaming, and 3 thick slices of toast spread with real yellow butter that was already beginning to melt into the bread. It was impossible. It was more food than she had seen on one plate in 4 years. It was the kind of abundance that belonged to memories of childhood, to a world before war and rationing and hunger. Troudel stared at it, unable to process what she was seeing. Around her, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Crystal made a sound like she had been punched, her hand flying to her mouth. Luitgard began to cry, tears streaming silently down her face as she stared at her plate. Further down the table, one woman laughed, a slightly hysterical sound that bordered on sobbing. Walburga sat frozen, her usual composure completely shattered. Her hands trembled as she reached toward her fork, then stopped, as if touching the food might make it disappear. "This is what we served at my wedding," she whispered in German, her voice breaking. "This much food, this abundance. I thought I would never see it again." Corporal Hobbs moved through the room, ensuring everyone had been served. When he reached Troudel's table, he noticed their paralysis. "It's real," he said gently in his Yorkshire accent. "It's yours. Please, eat while it's hot." But Troudel couldn't move. None of them could. Because this wasn't just breakfast. This was evidence that somewhere in the world, abundance still existed. For nearly a full minute, no one ate. 42 women sat before plates piled with more food than they had seen in years, unable to bring themselves to believe it was real. The smell alone was overwhelming. Bacon grease and butter, real coffee and toast, sausage and eggs combining into an aroma that seemed to come from another lifetime. Troudel picked up her fork with a shaking hand. She cut into one of the eggs, watching the yolk break and run golden across the plate, mixing with the beans and pooling against the toast. She lifted a small piece to her mouth and tasted it. The egg was rich, creamy, nothing like the powdered substitutes or the thin, watery eggs from half-starved chickens that she had eaten during the war. She began to cry. She couldn't help it. The taste was so overwhelming, so connected to memories of normalcy and peace, that her emotions simply spilled over. She wasn't alone. Around the dining hall, women were weeping openly as they ate, tears streaming down their faces while they chewed bacon and sausage. Luitgard couldn't swallow her first bite. She chewed it carefully, then sat with it in her mouth, unable to make herself swallow. Finally, Christelle reached over and touched her hand. "It's all right," she said softly. "It's real. You can eat it." Only then did Luitgard swallow, and immediately she began sobbing so hard that Troudel had to put an arm around her shoulders. The girl was 18 years old and couldn't remember the last time she had eaten meat that wasn't mostly filler. The sausage, rich and fatty and satisfying, was more than her emotions could handle. Some women ate slowly, savoring every bite as if trying to memorize the taste. Others ate quickly, almost desperately, as if the food might disappear if they didn't consume it immediately. Several couldn't eat at all, too overwhelmed to do more than stare at their plates through tears. Walburga cut her food into precise small pieces, but her hands shook so badly that her knife scraped against the plate. When she finally took a bite of the bacon, she closed her eyes and sat motionless for several seconds. When she opened them again, her cheeks were wet. "I had forgotten," she whispered. I had forgotten what real food tastes like. The British staff watched from the edges of the room, their expressions a mixture of satisfaction and discomfort. They had expected the women to be pleased, perhaps grateful, but this raw emotional response seemed to surprise them. Captain Cartwright stood near the door, her professional composure cracking as she watched women break down over eggs and toast. Corporal Hobbs approached Troutle's table again, concern evident on his face. "Is it?" He struggled for words. "Is something wrong with the food?" Troutle looked up at him through tears and managed to speak in broken English. "Nothing wrong. Everything perfect. Too perfect. We forgot such food exists." The corporal nodded slowly, beginning to understand. His own eyes looked suspiciously bright as he moved on to check other tables. After most of the women had managed to eat at least some of their breakfast, though many plates remained half full, Captain Cartwright approached Troutle's table. She had noticed that Troutle's English was the strongest among the prisoners, and she wanted to understand the intensity of their reaction. "May I sit?" she asked, gesturing to an empty chair. Troutle nodded, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "Yes, Captain." Captain Cartwright sat down and looked at the plates on the table, still piled with more food than the women could finish. "I need to understand something," she said carefully. "We meant this as a kindness, a celebration of peace, but I've never seen such distress over a meal. Have we done something wrong?" Troutle struggled to find the English words to explain. She looked at Walburga, who nodded permission for her to speak freely. Troutle took a breath and began. "In Germany, before war, such breakfast is not normal. Such food, so much, is only for very special occasions. Wedding breakfast, perhaps, holiday feast, not every day." She pointed to the eggs, the bacon, the sausages. "In last 3 years, I see egg perhaps 10 times, real bacon maybe 5 times, sausage with real meat almost never. This plate," she gestured to the abundance before her, "this is more than 1 week of German rations, maybe 2 weeks." Captain Cartwright's expression shifted to understanding and something that looked like guilt. "I see," she said quietly. Walburga spoke then, her English halting but determined. "My wedding breakfast, 1938. We have food like this: sausage, eggs, bacon, butter, bread. My family saved ration cards for 3 months to make such feast. Was most beautiful day." She paused, her voice cracking. "I think I never see such food again. I think this abundance is gone from world forever." Luitgard, emboldened by the other's honesty, added in broken English, "I am 18. I not remember time when such food is normal. To me this is," she searched for the word, "impossible." Captain Cartwright sat in silence for a moment, processing what they had told her. When she spoke again, her voice was softer than they had ever heard it. "For us, this is simply breakfast. A traditional breakfast, yes, but not uncommon. Before rationing, many British families ate like this every Sunday. I didn't realize," she paused. "I didn't understand how different your experience has been." Troudel found herself explaining further. "In Germany, propaganda tell us Britain is starving too. Tell us you have nothing, that you suffer like we suffer. But you have all this." She gestured around the dining hall. "You have enough to feed your enemies this way. It makes us understand that everything we were told was lies." The captain nodded slowly. "Not everything was lies," she said. "We did suffer, we did have rationing, but you're right that we never faced the starvation you describe. And now that rationing is easing, we have enough to share." She stood up, looking around at all the women with new understanding. "This breakfast was meant to welcome peace, but I see now it has done something more. It has shown you a truth that your government hid from you." 2 days after the breakfast that had shaken them all, Captain Cartwright called another assembly. This time, the mood was different, heavier with implications that everyone understood. Repatriation was no longer an abstract future event. It was becoming real, immediate, and terrifying. "Ladies," the captain began, "I have received official orders regarding your return to Germany. Transportation will begin within the next month." You will be processed through displaced persons camps and then released to return to your homes or to find your families." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Around the room, faces reflected fear, uncertainty, and something close to despair. Traudel felt her stomach clench. She had been dreading this announcement since the day she arrived, but the full English breakfast had made it somehow worse. Now she knew exactly what she was losing by leaving Britain. "You will each be interviewed individually to determine your destinations," Captain Cartwright continued. "If you have family locations, we will attempt to route you appropriately. If not, you will be sent to camps in the British occupation zone where you can seek information about relatives." Christelle reached over and gripped Traudel's hand under the table. Her palm was sweaty, trembling. Traudel squeezed back, offering what comfort she could, though she felt just as frightened. After the assembly, the women returned to their barracks in stunned silence. Finally, Walburga spoke. "We need to be practical about this. How many of us have confirmed family waiting in Germany?" The women looked at each other. Only 3 raised their hands. Traudel was not among them. Her father had been killed in an air raid in 1943. Her mother and sister had been in Stuttgart when last she heard from them, but that had been over a year ago. She had no idea if they were alive, if their home still stood, if she had anywhere to return to. Lutgard began to cry quietly. "I received a letter from the Red Cross last week," she whispered. "My parents are dead. My brother is missing. There is no one." Others shared similar stories. Families scattered or dead. Cities destroyed, homes reduced to rubble. The Germany they were being sent back to was not the Germany they had left. It was a devastated wasteland where millions wandered homeless and starving. Christelle voiced what many were thinking. What if we asked to stay? The suggestion was met with shocked silence. Walburga shook her head firmly. "We are German soldiers. We cannot abandon our country in its time of need, no matter how difficult the circumstances." "But are we still soldiers?" Traudel asked quietly. "The war is over. Germany has surrendered. What exactly would we be returning to serve?" It was a question none of them could answer. They sat in the barracks as evening fell, each wrestling with an impossible choice. Return to a homeland that might not exist anymore, where they would face starvation and suspicion, or somehow find a way to stay in the country that had been their enemy, that had shown them more kindness and abundance than their own nation had provided in years. That night, Traudel lay awake long after lights out, listening to the quiet sounds of women crying in the darkness. Tomorrow they would begin individual interviews about repatriation. And somehow she would have to decide what to say when Captain Cartwright asked her where she wanted to go home to. The individual interviews began the following morning. Captain Cartwright had set up a small office in the administration building where she met with each woman privately to discuss repatriation plans. The conversations were meant to be purely administrative, gathering information about family locations and destinations. But they became something far more complicated. Traudel was called in during the afternoon. She sat across the desk from the captain, Mrs. Davies positioned nearby to translate if needed, though Traudel's English had improved enough that she could manage most conversations on her own now. "Miss Bauer," Captain Cartwright began, "do you have confirmed family in Germany? Do you know where you would be going?" Traudel took a breath. "My mother and sister were in Stuttgart when I last heard from them. That was 14 months ago. I do not know if they are alive. I do not know if our home still exists. The Red Cross has no information." The captain made notes. "If we cannot locate your family, you would be sent to a displaced persons camp in the British zone. From there, you could search for them or begin rebuilding your life." Traudel's hands twisted in her lap. She had been rehearsing what she wanted to say, but now the words stuck in her throat. Finally, she forced them out. "Captain, may I ask something difficult?" "Of course. Is it possible for some of us to stay in Britain? Not permanently, perhaps, but until Germany is more stable?" Captain Cartwright set down her pen and looked at Traudel directly. "That's a very serious question, Miss Bauer. You understand that you would be choosing to remain in what was enemy territory rather than returning to your homeland?" Yes, Trudel said quietly. I understand how it sounds. But I must be honest with you. If I return to Germany now, I do not know if I will survive. There is no food. There is no shelter. There is no family that I know of. Here I have learned work skills. I have learned English. I have been treated with dignity, even as a prisoner. The captain was silent for a long moment. You're not the first to ask this. I've had 4 other women make similar requests this morning. But the war is over, Trudel said. We are no longer enemy soldiers. We are just displaced people with nowhere to go. Captain Cartwright nodded slowly. Let me be clear about what this would mean. You would no longer be prisoners of war, but you also would no longer be guaranteed housing or food. You would need to find sponsors in British communities, obtain work permits, prove that you can support yourselves. I understand, Trudel said. But I would rather face that uncertainty than return to certain starvation. After Trudel left, 5 more women made similar requests. By the end of the day, Captain Cartwright sat at her desk with a list of 11 names, 11 women who were choosing an uncertain future in Britain over an impossible return to Germany. While Captain Cartwright sent urgent communications to her superiors in London about the women's unprecedented request, letters began arriving from Germany that painted an increasingly grim picture of what repatriation would mean. The Red Cross had finally managed to establish some postal service through the occupied zones, and responses to the women's inquiries started trickling in. Christelle received a letter from a neighbor who had survived the bombing of Munich. The single page, written in shaky handwriting, described conditions that seemed almost incomprehensible. Your father's pharmacy was destroyed in the February raids, the letter read. The entire street is rubble. Most residents are dead or have fled. Those who remain are living in basements and bombed-out buildings. There is no food distribution system yet. People are eating whatever they can find. I saw a woman yesterday trying to make soup from grass and tree bark. Christelle read the letter aloud to the others in the barracks that evening, her voice breaking. The neighbor concluded, I do not know if you should return. There is nothing here for you now. Germany is a graveyard. More letters arrived over the following days, each one worse than the last. A woman received news that her entire family had died when their city was taken by Soviet forces. Another learned that her hometown had been so completely destroyed that it no longer appeared on maps. A third discovered that her mother was alive but living in a displaced persons camp, surviving on 900 calories per day of relief supplies. Luitgard's letter came from a Red Cross worker. It was brief and clinical. We regret to inform you that we have confirmed the deaths of your parents, Friedrich and Marta Berger, and your brother, Hans Berger. Your family home in Dresden was destroyed during the February bombing. We have no information about any other surviving relatives. The girl sat on her bunk, staring at the letter, unable to cry. She had suspected this news was coming, but seeing it confirmed in official writing made it real in a way that suspicion never had. She was 18 years old and completely alone in the world. Trudel sat beside her, not speaking, just offering presence. What would Luitgard return to? A city that no longer existed? No family? No home? No prospects? The repatriation that was supposed to represent freedom was beginning to look more like abandonment. Walburga, who had been the most insistent that they maintain their dignity as German soldiers and return home, received her own devastating news. Her sister wrote that Walburga's mother had died of starvation during the final winter of the war. The family bakery was gone. Her sister was living with strangers, working for food, barely surviving. That night, Walburga approached Trudel. I need to change my interview response, she said quietly. I need to ask about staying. By the end of the week, the number of women requesting to remain in Britain had grown from 11 to 14. They represented 1/3 of the prisoners, a significant enough number that London could no longer ignore Captain Cartwright's requests for guidance. The women waited in anxious limbo, knowing that bureaucrats hundreds of miles away were deciding their fates. Meanwhile, the letters from Germany kept coming, each one a reminder that the homeland they had served no longer existed in any meaningful way. The response from London took 3 weeks to arrive, during which time the women existed in a strange state of suspension between prisoner and free person, between German and potentially British, between past and future. When Captain Cartwright finally called another assembly in early September, everyone knew the decision had been made. "The War Office has reviewed your requests," she announced. "They have agreed to reclassify those who wish to remain as displaced persons rather than prisoners of war. This means you will no longer be held here, but you will need to secure sponsors and employment within 60 days or face deportation." Relief and terror washed over the 14 women in equal measure. They had won the right to stay, but now they faced the practical challenge of building lives in a country that had been their enemy, among people who might despise them for what Germany had done. Local churches were contacted about the situation, and to everyone's surprise, several responded positively. A Methodist congregation in nearby Harrogate offered to sponsor 2 women. A Quaker meeting house in York volunteered to help 3 more find housing and work. Individual families, moved by the women's story, came forward offering rooms and support. The Henderson family, who owned a small hotel in Harrogate, interviewed Trowdell personally. Mrs. Henderson was a practical woman in her 50s who asked direct questions. "Can you cook? Can you clean? Can you learn what needs learning?" "Yes," Trowdell answered to all 3. "I will work hard. I will cause no trouble. I only need a chance." The Hendersons agreed to sponsor her, offering room and board in exchange for work in their hotel kitchen. It was hardly glamorous, washing dishes and peeling vegetables, but it was honest work and a path forward. Trowdell accepted gratefully. Christelle found placement with a doctor's family in York, helping care for their 3 children while studying English in the evenings. Luitgard, still fragile but determined, was taken in by an elderly couple who had lost their own daughter in the war and saw in her a chance at redemption for everyone. Walburga, with her experience in her family's bakery, was offered an apprenticeship with a baker in Leeds who was willing to overlook her nationality in exchange for her skills. The older woman threw herself into the work with fierce determination, as if by making perfect bread she could somehow atone for Germany's sins. The transition was not easy. Some townspeople were hostile, muttering about Nazis being given special treatment while British soldiers were still being demobilized. Windows were occasionally broken at houses known to be sheltering Germans. Ugly words were sometimes shouted in the street. But there were also moments of unexpected grace. A shopkeeper who gave Trowdell extra rations when no one was looking. A child who smiled at Luitgard in church. A neighbor who taught Christelle Yorkshire pudding recipes while carefully avoiding mention of the war. These small kindnesses accumulated like interest, building towards something that might eventually become belonging. Corporal Hobbs visited Trowdell at the Henderson Hotel one afternoon, ostensibly to check on her adjustment, but really just to see how she was managing. She served him tea, proud to be on the other side of service. "See," he said, grinning. "Told you that breakfast was just the beginning." 20 years later, in the summer of 1965, Edeltraud Bauer Henderson stood in the kitchen of her own restaurant in Harrogate, preparing the morning's first orders. She was 41 years old now, a British citizen, married to the Hendersons' son Thomas, and mother of 3 children who spoke English without accent and knew Germany only through their mother's carefully edited stories. Her restaurant, the Welcome Table, had become locally famous for one particular item on the menu. Every Sunday, she served a traditional full English breakfast, prepared exactly the way it had been served to her that transformative morning in August 1945. Eggs fried in real butter, crispy bacon, proper sausages, beans, mushrooms, tomatoes, toast. She made each plate with the same abundance that had once made her weep. Regular customers knew her story, or parts of it. They knew she had been a German prisoner of war, that she had chosen to stay in Britain, that she had built a life here through determination and the kindness of strangers. Today was special. Christelle was visiting from London, where she had become a translator for the Foreign Office. Luitgard was coming from Manchester, where she taught German at a girls' school. Even Walburga had traveled from Leeds. now the owner of her own bakery. They gathered in Traudel's restaurant for a reunion, 20 years after the morning that had changed everything. They sat at a corner table, older now, their faces marked by 2 decades of life in their adopted country. Traudel served them herself, bringing out plates piled high with the full breakfast. For a moment, they were 21 and 23, and 18 and 28 again, staring in disbelief at abundance they thought had vanished from the world. "Do you remember," Lutgard said quietly, "how we thought it must be wedding food? How we couldn't understand that people ate like this normally?" Traudel nodded. "We had forgotten what it meant to have enough. We thought kindness was impossible between enemies." "But it wasn't," Christelle added. "Captain Cartwright showed us that even in the darkest times, people can choose mercy over vengeance." Walburga, ever practical, was already eating. She paused to say, "This breakfast taught me that home isn't where you come from, it's where people treat you like you deserve to live." A young couple entered the restaurant, immigrants from somewhere by their accents, their clothes worn and their expressions uncertain. Traudel recognized that look, had seen it in her own mirror 20 years ago. She approached their table with menus and her warmest smile. "Welcome," she said. "Let me tell you about our Sunday breakfast special. It's more than just food, it's a tradition of hospitality, of second chances." As she walked back to the kitchen to prepare their meals, Traudel thought about that August morning in 1945 when a simple breakfast had shown her that the world was bigger and kinder than she had been taught. She had spent 20 years trying to pay forward that kindness, feeding people, welcoming strangers, offering the same mercy she had been given. The full English breakfast had taught her about more than food. It had taught her about the possibility of transformation, about forgiveness, and about building home in unexpected places.